Which were the most challenging situations when you were working across borders with, journalists of other parts of the world in different stories?
Okay. Okay, it really depends what story you're working on firstly, and what country you're dealing with. I guess the most challenging situation that I faced would have been, which is not with Latin America, which is a story that we did about Prisoner X. So that was a story which involved research in Australia and research in Israel. And because it was a state secret in Israel and there was a gag order on the case, it was virtually impossible formally to break through the barriers. So we had to find ways to get around the barriers, which involved, in the case of Australia, freedom of information requests. It involved people talking to us off the record. In Israel, it involved a combination of informal approaches to gain access to databases and to gain access to records. So in a sense, I mean, it's an interesting sort of challenge because the methodology was, in some ways, it demonstrated a combination of traditional and non-traditional. I mean, if we just stuck to kind of traditional ways of trying to get access to information, we wouldn't have succeeded because essentially we had to break through state security. And it was a really interesting example, actually, of how even today, and I really stress this, it is so much about, or one of the fundamental elements is just access and communication and good relationships with other journalists and other people working in similar areas.
So when do you know when you trust a journalist that, you never met before, somebody from overseas?
Oh, good question. Look, sometimes you just have to make an educated guess, and sometimes you know them or you know of them. So quite often, and you look at what they've written or what they've broadcast, so you get a sense of who they are in terms of where they sit, for example, on the political spectrum, which doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be honourable people. But what I find generally, and this is a general thing, that most serious investigative journalists are keen to get stuff out. And, if it's in their interests as much as in my interests or your interests, very often they'll cooperate. It might be that they're not in the position to broadcast or write about a story as it was in the case of Prisoner X in Israel. They wanted to get the story out. They knew the only way it could be gotten out was if it was done internationally. So there was a common interest there. So I think the other thing is, look, you have to feel your way. You have to, find out as much as you can about the journalists, see what they've produced, and then maybe even, go on your gut and ask around.
Mm-hmm. What about the differences in ethics, for example, working with a journalist you never worked with before?
Well, look, I think, again, if you're working in the area of investigative journalism, I mean, that tends to attract certain kinds of journalists. And, for example, there are some kinds of journalists who work in certain kind of media that, I wouldn't, that I would know straight away that we would have, we wouldn't be interested in the same kind of journalism. We wouldn't be after the same or investigating the same kinds of things. I think that in my experience, and I've worked a lot internationally, I haven't really found that to be a problem. In fact, I've been quite impressed that most people, I wouldn't say all, but most people I've dealt with internationally who've been investigating or sharing investigation have had pretty good ethics similar to the sorts of ethics that, the better kind of journalism adheres to in Australia.
When there is money involved, in terms of journalists who expect to be paid or needed to be paid, or there is a funding to share. So how Have you come across any situation of that kind?
Yeah, look, that's a huge problem. I think that's a really huge problem in journalism because, you know, you go to somewhere where you're investigating something and people are, you know, it's a country or where people are in much more humble circumstances. And of course, they see you come from the first world. For example, say you're a television journalist or producer. I mean, obviously the perception is that you have money. You're able to travel and you're able to come to this country. So you must have money. So look, I think that's a very delicate area. And I think it's something that you just have to think about quite a lot. I mean, it seems to me if you're working with people, you pay them as you would. For example, if you're working with an investigative journalist and they work with you side by side, then you would pay them as you would any journalist by the day. If you came to an agreement that you were going to share the material, then I think that, you know, you'd have to negotiate that and honour that agreement. But I think it is a very grey area, and I think even more so with talent. I think with international journalism and with other journalists, it's not as complicated as it is with talent. I think that's a very complex problem. And I think what we saw, the real kind of worst example of that, and I don't believe that ABC or SBS would ever do that, but we saw it with Channel 9 60 Minutes in the Lebanon case. That was an extreme example of something that I'm 100% sure we would never find ourselves, we would never enter into a situation like that. But I believe that all journalists are faced with this situation, and I think it's a grey area. Got to be dealt with.
So it would be a case-by-case situation?
Absolutely case by case. And sometimes it's quite difficult, and it's the sort of thing that I think that's caused me more, shall I say, moral dilemmas than anything else in television. And sometimes, perhaps it's more so in television, I'm not sure, than in print, but I know that it's something that that has been an issue all along the way. And I think with television, especially with talent, because, you know, people will participate, but they often won't participate or say that they won't participate unless you remunerate them in some way, which may be some kind of, you make a donation to a community centre that they're working at or something. There are ways around it, but I still think it's very complex and case-by-case basis.
So what do you think in general about the fact of proposing or discussing a methodology?
Well, it's an interesting thing, isn't it? When you said, I think you're right, that we don't sort of sit down and have formal conversations about it. But at the same time, I'm thinking about all those students who go to university and study journalism. And, you know, there's a proliferation of journalism schools in Australia. Maybe that's the same across the world, but they do discuss these issues. And in terms of methodology, well, I have a way of working, which one might describe as a methodology, and part of that way of working is certainly, I think, improved greatly by discussing with other colleagues. So when I say methodology, I want to ask you, do you mean, for example, I read something about a story, I think it looks interesting, I think it might be worth pursuing. Is your question, how do I go about it?
Yes. So what do you do? I'm thinking when we're talking about just national investigative journalism, that has another layer.
Yep.
So it's going to be collaborative.
Yep.
Sometimes you'll be able to travel, sometimes you won't. So you have all sorts of added challenges, from exchange of information to trust building to, narrow what's the story, because normally you have a topic and then you have to find the story within the topic. So what's really the topic? Does the other journalist understands and shares, and so from the beginning you have a story, it involves 3 countries, let's say. How do you go about it? To not be dragging and trying to be forever, thinking about this idea. And because out of 10 stories that are successful, there are 200 that never made it. And sometimes it's not about the story itself, but about, making it happen with the resources we have that are limited.
Look, it's an interesting thing, because one of the things that one of the things that I think about any story that's critical is, the research. But at the same time, I also think there's something, and I'm not sure about this, but I think there's something. You read something about a story, and I think sometimes there's something about a good journalist that has a nose, dare I say it, for a good story, right? Now, having a nose for a good story is one thing, but what your next step, or my next step, would be is to start doing research. And that research, we're talking about 3 countries, then what I would do is look at quite specifically at who else might be researching that story in one or other country. And I think probably I would try and look for that story in other countries if it had been written about, if it had been, a story had been made about it. And I would also, I think again, I come back to the personal contacts, and I think it makes a huge difference. And I think it's incredibly important in building up a methodology that you have good contacts, that is other journalists or other academics that you can contact, that you can talk to, who have maybe working on that story or have similar interests, and would be able to give you more context and more perspective, and maybe would, either make you think, look, not worth pursuing, or maybe worth pursuing, or definitely worth pursuing. So I think in journalism generally that we don't, and I think it's become less now with social media and journalists sitting at their computers 24/7. I mean, okay, so you're doing it internationally, it's a long way away. It's not like you can say, let's have a coffee. But I really think it's incredibly important to have a good network of people, and they may be academics in institutes, universities, or other journalists who you trust and who whose work is good, that you feel you can run something past. Plus, looking at what's been done in other countries and seeing, well, maybe there's nothing that's been done, maybe there's something that's been done, and on the basis of that sort of form an opinion, do I take this to the next step? Is it worth pursuing?
So based on this chart that I sent to you, is there anything here that you think, well, that's useless, or maybe I wouldn't put it, and then also on the other side, oh, look, this is important and it's missing?
I was just going to say, in relation to the resources and the timeline, look, that really depends on who you're working for, and the broadcaster or the print magazine, and also what program you're working for. I mean, it varies so much, and I think that's one of the things that, I'm not interested in news. I mean, news is news. News is just a reproduction of what happened in the last 24 hours. If we're interested in investigative journalism, the resources thing is huge, and that might mean, like you say, identifying which contacts are worth talking to, but that's, I guess, Skyping, calling, I think mailing and saying it's the identification, isn't it, of those that are relevant and also available. I mean, I find people are very busy, and that is a huge problem. Everybody everywhere of the kind of people we're talking about, incredibly busy. So you've got to find a way to get access to them, and then maybe talk about collaboration, because, for example, one thing that I notice is often when I contact people, they're very happy to have one phone conversation, and then unless there's something specific in it for them, they just don't have the time or the interest. And I think it's got to be reciprocal. So I think it is really important to negotiate something. For example, I think sometimes there are stories that we can do internationally about events or things that are happening in other countries that maybe they are not in the position to do because of their resources, and maybe sort of issues to do, political issues or issues to do with sensitivity of the story. So it may be in their interests to be involved in one way or another, or at least to have their name on the story, although in some cases that's not the case. I remember working a couple of times in Iran, and the people we worked with specifically didn't want their name on the story. So you've got to be very sensitive to the local conditions, and also, I mean, sometimes it can be even difficult talking to people because, that's another issue. All those issues to do with security and sensitivity, and sometimes it's not convenient for people to talk to you on the phone. So it might be that you need to, and I think this is happening increasingly, where you actually need to find someone on the ground that you can work with who may go off and do work for you, and of course it's paid, that you can't do from Sydney, Australia.
After that, I call it protocol, agreed, that it has to, this is a code of ethics or a code of practice or some basics. I don't know if it's a whole code that, okay, this is what I work with, do you agree with this? Or is, okay, in this particular case, these are things that are sensitive. Or in this particular case, this journalist is also an advocate, and you have some journalist advocates in some parts of the world that is a bit more rare to find here in Australia, doing investigative journalism and being advocates, but it is very common in other parts. So that conversation, I think, is really important to have it at the beginning and be very explicit instead of at the end, to manage expectations as well, right?
I think that's a really important issue because, in the context of Australia, investigative journalists are respected, advocate journalists are not. There's a real line that's drawn between that, and people will talk about someone and say, oh, she's too much of an advocate journalist. And I think that's it's interesting that you say, and I know in many other parts of the world you have not just an investigative, but also a journalist who you could describe in our terms as an advocate journalist. And that's a big question, because I think that's also a question where you have to think about knowing where that person is coming from, put it this way, what their political position is. You also have to take that in mind in countries where politics is very polarised. And I think there are some I've come across so many good journalists in other parts of the world who I think are excellent investigative journalists and not just advocacy journalists. So I think it depends. There's such many different contexts that you have to be aware of. I mean, there are many instances where you don't know very much about the person that you're talking about, but if it's a journalist, an investigative journalist, you often can look at the work that they've done, and previously, and maybe it's to do with having worked in international journalism for, 25 or 30 years. I have a network of people I would want, ideally, not always the case, to be able to ask someone about this journalist before they actually spoke to them. Now, that's almost a privilege, isn't it? Because most people, and mostly we're not in that situation. So I guess, would I talk about it at the beginning? Well, I think it's pretty important to draw up the rules from the beginning, and it's go with the flow. It sounds a bit loose to me. I think I would opt towards if I'm going to call up a person and say, I'm doing this, this and this, and would you be interested in doing this, this and this? I think I tend to want to be pretty upfront from the beginning. And I think it's fairer to them. And also I think it's a better practice if people agree to be involved or not, or agree to talk or not, because they're informed about who I am and what I'm doing and what my interests and expectations are.
You start with a hypothesis or question, and then once you have the team, I think that has to be reviewed because, with other countries, maybe probably your question, your story will change, So you start working on another hypothesis because the one that triggered in the investigation initially is only from your point of view, and you'll have the input from the rest. So I think we have to be flexible to that and not just impose our first story.
Oh, absolutely.
Otherwise, what's the point? you know.
Oh, I couldn't agree more, but I think that happens all the time, doesn't it? That you have an idea and you start to investigate it and you realise that, you know, what your idea might have been, is not anything. I mean, you go on a journey, to use that awful word, but you discover as you go. It's a process, and I don't go in. I might go in with some ideas, but usually I'm, you know, surprised along the way, and certainly very open. I mean, that's the whole process of journalism, isn't it? Not going in with a fixed idea, but actually being open to what you find along the way. That's why you research. And certainly I think my experience with other journalists in other countries, I mean, I just feel really privileged. I've worked with so many really, you know, competent, intelligent people who have different perspectives to mine, but simply would enrich and maybe change the course of the story, depending what we found out.
One of the things that I'm not sure if we do enough is backgrounding and research on the open sources in all countries. But maybe, you know, I think it's something really rich of you know, investigating with other colleagues, because going into the open file, you know, on the files of the government, or doing, you know, accessing information that is public from here, maybe you don't know how to navigate, even language-wise, and to know who is who, you know. So I think that could be a lot of sometimes we get into a lot of trouble for under things that are actually public. So I think that could be a first step that sometimes we don't.
I agree. I absolutely agree. Look, the thing is, I think that's a big issue because and that's where collaborating with, you know, journalists who live in that country could be enormously useful. I mean, it might be, well, language is a huge thing. If you don't speak the language, which, you know, in many cases one doesn't, we are relying on other people, which in fact can be okay, but it certainly is a limitation, one. And two, like you say, that's where one would rely very much on collaboration, because in many cases I wouldn't be aware, or someone wouldn't be aware where it is and how to look for it. And that was a very specific example with the Zigir case in Israel. There was certain information which I needed to get about a gag order which had been taken out on the Ben Zigir case, and I tried looking for it, but I had no idea really how to find it, and it was through contact through a particular lawyer who agreed indirectly to help. He was able, and who obviously was based in Israel, he was able to navigate someone who spoke Hebrew through that database. Now, I could never have done that, A, because I don't speak Hebrew, and B, I didn't know where to look.
Then the next of the steps are pretty, you know, straightforward. Exchange the information, systematize it. Then we, you know, after you have all that first open sources, then you are, you know, you have a third hypothesis, and then you go to the field work, you know, to do the research itself, and, you know, more data, interview, sourcing. Then you cross the information, and then I'm thinking about the verification and validation, you know, validation of the sources and verification of the information. Is there different understandings maybe about what verification and validation is?
I think that's really difficult. I mean, I'm just thinking about a couple of examples that come to mind. One is we tried, from Foreign Correspondent, we looked to going to Vietnam, and I was wanting to do a story on the environment, and it was impossible to find anyone to work with, because it wasn't going to be a story that the Vietnamese government was going to like. That was one thing. The other thing that really comes to mind is having been in lectures and tutorials, taken lectures and tutorials with some students, postgraduate students from countries such as China, you know, where you grow up in a culture which is very different, where you don't ask certain questions, you don't even know which questions to ask, because I believe that people in power, governments in power, should be held accountable. So there are big cultural differences, and I'm not quite sure, and political differences. I'm not quite sure how you deal with that, because I think it's quite complicated. You can't force people to do our kind of journalism, investigative journalism, if we know that if they do it, they might be thrown in prison.
And then you have all the legal checks, how the publication will impact all the people involved in the investigation, that it will be differently.
Absolutely. And let me just mention there, Iran, we did some stories, or a particular long form story in 2004 in Iran. And in both cases, we worked with a fantastic local producer who had worked and was a print journalist as well. And also our main talent was a blogger challenging the regime. And when we left, both of them were arrested and put in jail. And they both got out eventually. And of course, we were we were really worried. And we, in a case like that, what do? You contact all of the organisations that you possibly can, and you try and contact family and ask, well, what can we do? I mean, are we supposed to be trying to get them out of the country and get them, asylum? Or so we felt very strongly that before we went into this story, they were certainly very aware of what they were doing and the sort of possible impact for them. But nevertheless, I think those situations, they were very informed. They were kind of quite mature and sophisticated. I think you have to be enormously careful with the people that you are going to work with in other countries, because I think sometimes, we leave. If we go there, they stay behind, and they often have to bear the ramifications. So I think that's a real responsibility, and one that, people sometimes don't take nearly seriously enough.
One of the things that I realized, and I was surprised when I went to the last conference of investigative journalists in Latin America, was that one of them mentioned that in the last, 12 years, 10 presidents in Latin America had to be stepped down from their position, or they were, put to jail as a consequence of investigative stories, which I think is extraordinary about the impact. We don't hear about those stories. So that makes me think, what real stories are from Africa? What are is this understanding there is no accountability in these countries, that is, all chaos, but those are certain facts, and it happened. So why we don't pick up that stories?
I think that what happens is that people, journalists generally, and it is a time thing, and it is about, I think it's also a laziness. I think people, go to the same people. We do live in a small country, but there's so many interesting people. And what we do is we give legitimacy to the same people. And we don't give legitimacy to all these other informed and interesting voices. And it's, and I think we keep doing that and keep doing that. And in this country, what happens is we tend, although there's a lot more pressure now to diversify, but we tend to give, it's all about middle-aged men in suits. It's so, lazy and traditional. And look, people are aware about it much more than they were. I think there's been quite a lot of pressure, for example, on the ABC, because that's a really, it's a publicly funded institution. And I think there is a sort of a bit of a shift going on. Look, I suppose one of the problems is that historically, most journalists in this country have come from particular kinds of backgrounds, middle-class white backgrounds, and so that becomes reproduced in the sorts of people that they go to get commentary from. So look, it's a huge problem. It's a structural problem. It's it's a class and race problem. I think that media organisations have to put, and I'm not quite sure how you do this, but they have to put structures in place, which means that you're recruiting processes are completely different, because until your institutions change and you have people who represent a more diverse class and race background, and also people, you know, have got to stop being so lazy and just using the same people, we're going to have the same problem. I mean, you look at any program on television, it's all the same people. Look, the only thing I'd say that's interesting, there's a lot of, you know, a lot of traditional media has shut down, and there's huge shifts going on in media across the board. But there are a lot of new startups and also online publications. And I think that's really the interesting part of what's going on in the media. And I was just sort of thinking about, you know, a digital newspaper like El Faro in El Salvador. I mean, their investigative work is excellent. I don't read it. I mean, they do investigations, and I'm also thinking there's a website in the States called Narratively, and they basically, you know, very much about long-form investigative stories. And I think there is a bit of a shift back against the kind of celebrity, you know, 30-second news grab. I mean, I think there is somewhere people are actually interested in more analysis and more depth.
The news are based on the feeds that we received.
Yep.
It's very passive.
Yep, that's...
Yep. 30 feeds and I choose 10 out of the 30.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And the
and who sent you those feeds? Who decided? So our editorial is based on somebody else's editorial.
And how do we change that? Because that's the key question, isn't it? And I agree with you 100%. I think it's hugely problematic. And in fact, I just noticed today, this is just one tiny example, that for economic reasons, the ABC is cutting down on a large number of feeds, right? Now, which, you know, are apparently in terms of, well, financial, this is what I read, particularly in certain areas, is going to impact on the quality. But that said, I mean, and in fact, I think one of the ones they were cutting out was AFP. So, you know, it very well may mean that all of our sources that we use at the ABC, which is our biggest public broadcaster, is going to be sources from English-speaking networks. And that in itself is a problem. You know, it's about a particular vision of the world, a particular view of the world. So I think it's a huge problem. I think there was a kind of a hope and a feeling that things sort of really changed in Australia at a particular time. Maybe it was the sort of times of Keating and, you know, a long time ago now, but people who had more of a vision and were more sort of cosmopolitan and modern, and now we're just, honestly, I think it's, in a way, what we are today as Australia is, in a sense, maybe a reflection of just how conservative and old-fashioned we are.
You know, the ISO 9000 quality control standards that we have, you know, standards for everything, basically, that when when a society or a group of experts agree that for certain products or services, there needs to be an agreed international minimum standard, right?
Yep.
So we thought, okay, would it be possible to apply that for investigative journalism? And that would be in the interest of the journalists. So if there was a norm that, you know, it's like, how is fact checked or whatever. So you want, as a journalist, especially if you're a freelancer, if they say, yeah, it meets the standards, they give you a kind of logo, or like, you know, they do in Twitter with authentication.
I think it's a good idea in theory, but I'm not sure in practice. I mean, in theory, yeah, it's a great idea. But do you think, I mean, it seems to me, do you think it's more realistic to think that you have these organisations in each country? Like, for example, we have the MEAA, and if you're a member of the MEAA, then you're supposed to adhere to certain principles and standards. I wonder whether it's more practical to think about where you have organisations like that are country-wide, but that those organisations belong to something that is international.
Well, in this case, like for example, if they adopt this standard, the MEAA would be the one who runs it.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting about that is we know, you know, as media organisations have shrunk and the media is going through a lot of change, we have a lot of people working as freelancers. So that means, and it's much more difficult for them. You know, there's been a lot of stories about how difficult it's for freelancers, I mean, who go into high-risk situations because they don't have the same protections that journalists or, you know, media workers who work for big organisations. And there have been people who will go to any length to get a story and they don't have the proper protection. So I think that maybe it's an extension of you know, because they're, like you say, they're the people who are more vulnerable and don't need who need the recognition, but who don't have the formal structures for that recognition.
Well, Vivien, thank you so much.
Okay, I hope
everything.
I hope you've got everything that you need.